You mentioned Hayek. Who is this guy? What's his relationship to Milton Friedman in the space of ideas and in the context of the Great Depression? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So F.A. Hayek is an Austrian economist who takes up a posting in London, and he's in a mentee rather of Ludwig von Mises. He's writing about business cycles, Austrian capital theory, and the Depression hits, and he's one of the few economists who in the beginning really is not calling for much intervention. Although, as he realizes how politically unpalatable that is, he will develop a more softened version of Austrian economics that has room for a whole range of social services. What's significant about Hayek is that he is also watching what's happening in Austria, what's happening in Germany, and he's really worried the same thing is going to happen to the Western democracies. And he sees the root cause of this is socialism, this shift towards an expanded role for government, which we've been talking about is happening in the United States. It's also happening in Britain. And so he writes this book that becomes incredibly famous, The Road to Serfdom, basically saying, taking these steps towards a planned economy or an economy that's a modified form of capitalism is he's very clear that this is not an inevitability, but if the same steps are taken and people follow the same line of thinking, we may end up in a sort of coercive, totalitarian state. So this becomes enormously popular in the United States. First of all, he's in good touch with Friedman's teachers, even before this book comes out. They see them as kindred spirits. Frank Knight is in touch with him. Henry Simons is in touch with him. They all see themselves as liberals. They call themselves old-fashioned, unreconstructed liberals. And so even before he becomes famous, Hayek will be trying to kind of organize thinkers and intellectuals who he believes shares his values of what we would call today classical liberalism, and to kind of create a counter consensus to the one that's gathering. Now, Hayek also chooses not to argue against Keynes, and he feels that this is a huge missed opportunity, that he should have staked out the case against Keynes, and that because he did not, people come to believe there is no case against Keynes. Keynes is literally unanswerable. So Hayek will have this great regret. He will channel some of his regrets into sort of community building, specifically developing the Mont Pelerin Society. And it will fall to Friedman to really make that case against Keynes. But Hayek will end up at Chicago, and Hayek really influences Friedman to think about what Hayek calls the competitive order and how the state can and must maintain a competitive order. That is, a system of laws, of norms, of practices that makes it possible for markets to function. And this is one of these key differentiators between the older philosophy of laissez-faire and the newer reconceptualization of liberalism, which says, yes, we need a state. We need a state that's not intervening in markets under social democratic auspices, but is structuring and supporting markets so that they can function with maximum freedom, keeping in mind that if there aren't basic social supports needed, the market is apt to generate the type of either inequality or social instability that will call the whole system into question. So Hayek is really key in promoting this modified liberalism. But from being a very prominent economist in the 1920s and 1930s, as mathematics becomes the language of economics, Hayek is completely left out in the cold. Now, Friedman to some degree is left out in the cold, but Friedman at least has proved to the mathematical economists that he knows what they're up to, and he's rejecting it from a position of expertise and knowledge. And he literally drives the mathematical economists out of Chicago. They're clustered in a group called the Coles Commission, and he makes their life hell. They flee. They flee the Friedman onslaught. But then when Hayek arrives at the University of Chicago, he would like to be considered for a position in the economics department, and Milton Friedman says, no way. You're not really an economist because you're not empirical, because you just develop these theories. So he has an appreciation for Hayek as a social thinker, but not as an economist. So what Friedman decides to do, his answer to Keynes will be deeply empirical, but it will also be theoretical. And it will create an alternative intellectual world and approach for economists who aren't satisfied with Keynesianism. And almost single-handedly, Friedman will introduce sort of political and ideological diversity into the field of economics, because from his beachhead in Chicago, he will develop the theory of monetarism.